Hi, today we're going to play the Caro Kann defense, and this one is for black. So let's start. So after e4, we are going to play pawn c6. That will be followed by pawn d4. And then pawn d5, pawn e5, and pawn c5, pawn c3, knight to c6, knight to f3, pawn takes on d4, takes back, bishop g4 followed by bishop e2, pawn e6, pawn h3, and we'll take the knight on f3. They will take back, and then we'll play queen b6, and then after the most natural move, bishop e3, and then we are going to take on b2 followed by knight d2, the only way to protect the rook. And then we'll play bishop b4, and we are having a good attacking idea, and we are winning in this position. So let's go to the other variation, e4 c6, pawn d4, pawn d5, pawn e5, followed by pawn c5, pawn c3, and then knight c6. And then if they play bishop b5, and then we'll play queen a5, and then after bishop takes knight, pawn takes on c6, and then bishop d2 played by white, and then queen b6. We are attacking the pawn, and we will be winning a bit of material, and white I cannot do anything about that. So let's go to the other variation of this game. e4, e5, pawn d4, pawn d5, and then pawn e5, and then pawn c5 takes. So if white takes, and then we'll play knight c6, and then after knight f3, and then we'll play bishop g4. Again, the most common move would be pinning on knight to the king with bishop b5. And then after queen a5, check. And then the only move to shape the check and the bishop would be knight c3. And then we'll play e6. As you can see here, we are up in development. We're flattening the c5 pawn. So let's go to the other line. e4, c6, d4, and then pawn d5, pawn e5, and then pawn c5, pawn c3, and then knight c6. And then if white plays pawn f4, we'll play pawn takes on d4. And then after white takes back, and let's play a move that you never played before. Pawn h5. And then after knight f3, we'll pin the knight after knight e2, and then pawn e6, and white castle's kingside, and then we'll play queen b6, check, and then we're having a stronger position, so let's do the other variation, e4, c5, d4, d5, and then pawn e5, pawn c5, and then takes, and then knight c6. And then if they play bishop b5 after this move, and then we'll play pawn e6. Now the most common move would be bishop e3, and then followed by knight e7, followed by pawn c3, and then we'll play knight f5, bishop d4, and then bishop d7. And we're having a stronger attack between the king. So let's learn another opening called the King's Indian Defense. Pawn b4, f6. So this is the starting line of the King's Indian Defense. Pawn c4, pawn g6, pawn c3, and then bishop to g7, and then pawn e4, and then pawn b6. This is a very essential move. And then after knight f3, and then after knight f3, our development featuring the King's Indian Defense is done. All we have to do is actually play the moves for it. And then after we castle, the most common move would be bishop e2. we'll play pawn e5. And then after white castles themselves kingside. And then we'll play pawn takes d4. The knight would take back. And then we'll play rook e8. And after pawn f3, and then we'll play pawn c6. And then after bishop e3, and then we'll play pawn d5. And then after black takes, and then we're going to do a sweet knight sacrifice. Knight d5. The idea is if black takes, we can play queen b6. And then after black moves the knight, it will not be good for them. So then if black notices, the first safety move would be bishop f2. And then we'll play knight f4 and bishop c4. And then we'll play queen g5. And then bishop g3. And then now we can play queen c3. And we're going to win the knight after rook d8. So let's go to the other line of the King's Indian defense. d4 and f6, c4, and then g6, knight c3, bishop g7, pawn e4, and then pawn d6, followed by knight f3, and then we'll castle, bishop e2, and then we'll play e5, And then after we castle, and then pawn takes on d4, knight takes on d4, rook to e8, followed by pawn f3, and then we'll play pawn c6, bishop e3, bishop e3, and then pawn d5, takes, and then after bishop back to f2, and then we attack the other bishop, bishop c4, and then if they play after our usual queen g5, if they play pawn g3, we're going to give a check. And then after the king shuffles, and then in the second move, we'll grab the bishop and then we'll emerge with an extra piece. And then you already know what will happen after king g2. The top will be in danger. Knight f4 would be the first move. If they do it anyway, f4, the king will be forced back. And then why would we make a 3-4 repetition? Or if you could just play bishop h3. So, and then black would emerge victorious. But anyway, let's start a new game. e4 f6. Should have that. g6, knight c3, bishop g7, and then pawn e4, and then pawn d6, knight f3, and then castles, bishop e2, and then pawn e5, the king castles, and then after black takes, rook e8, pawn f3, and then pawn c6, And then if the king knows, if the white player knows what we are doing, then they'll think if they play king h1, they would be totally safe. But it's kind of the opposite. I will play pawn d5. We'll play knight d7 again. So that's all I've got for today. I'm out of time. I will see you later. Bye.